So the answer to the question was what inspired me to focus on this, and there's several ways to answer that question, I suppose. I've always been very interested in culture, particularly because we come to it very innocently as audiences, but culture, pop culture, is political. It's coded with political messages, and we go to it quite, not naively, but I think innocently is the right way. And I've always had an interest in that. That's number one. Number two, I'm also very exhausted by the idea that the West is the center of the world. And as influenced as we are by Western culture, and I certainly am, and I think many of us here would agree that we are, it is not the center. And if you don't live in the West, then you know that. You have access to Indian films, Pakistani music, Egyptian TV, you have access to so much, and you know that the world is multipolar. It's not unipolar. And so I wanted to focus on that. I wanted to look at Asia and the way in which Asia is changing the field of pop culture. So Turkey, which has a very quite a close connection to Pakistan, is interesting because it is a country who has political design, certainly. Erdogan imagines himself as the leader of Ottomania and sees himself as a new king of the Muslim world, a new guide and spiritual leader of the Muslim world. That is reflected and not reflected in the shows, and I'm interested in that. As for the background, my father was very interested in pop culture, and I watch films the way I do because of my father, because he loved to watch films and he liked to discuss them quite seriously. When he was young, I mean, Gudu is here, and they used to put together a magazine, which they did. Maybe you have one. Oh, hang on. Okay. So, I mean, this is very lucky. I didn't plan this, but when they were teenage boys in Karachi, they used to print this magazine called Venceremos,
yep,
inspired by Che Guevara. And what is that except culture, the spread of culture and the spread of different narratives? And he took that with him everywhere he went. So I grew up in Syria in exile with my father, and he used to listen to Ho Jamalo. Abida Perveen's music used to be played at home. So this idea of culture as frivolous, I never accepted. Culture is political, it's meaningful, it's how we see ourselves in the world. So that's why I wrote this book.
I'll share a little story with you. So this was in 1968, and me and Yusuf Khanpur, we met your great father, Bhutto Sahib. And of course, I was an activist in those days. And so we had a long meeting, and your grandfather was reluctant to show me his library, but I insisted. I finally saw it, 70 Clinton. So then, as we were leaving, he said, "Come on, let me show you something." So he took me to the outside, within your corridor, within the home. There was a little hut in the corner. And he said, "Let me show you something." He wanted me to introduce me with your father. Your father had a little hut, and Bhutto Sahib said, "Let me go and introduce my Che Guevara." He thinks he's Che Guevara, but he was not there at that time.
Yeah.
But I think he would stay in the main, home, and then he'd spend a lot of time out there in a little hut in the corner.
Yeah.
So that's 1968.
Oh,
So you may not know that.
No, I wasn't born then.
Yeah, but you, so that's what he used to think, even at that time. That you're Che Guevara.
Thank you. Are there people? Are you waiting for? Yeah. Why don't you come up then?
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
One question I had was, it's interesting that one of the biggest criticisms of the American century was the promotion of distinctly American values. So democracy over communism, neoclassical economics over, whatever, et cetera, et cetera. In this new world, do you see the new kings promoting their own distinct values and the national friction that comes with that? Just as you said, Turkish's view of promoting a fundamentally Islamic worldview, right? I'm just curious, in this new world of like almost democratization, but a multilateral world, what are the pitfalls or just some of the general concerns in your studies that you have seen?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really interesting question. And I think, we have this we've been subjected to this idea that there is something known as American values or European values, and I'm always confused by that. Like, what is a European value? Why is liberty a European value and not a universal value? But yes, I mean, I think Turkey is an interesting case because it's both. You know, the clip I showed you comes from a particular line of thinking. You know, Erdogan has said himself of another show, Ertugrul, which is on Netflix, you can watch. Erdogan has said, until the lions start to write their own stories, the hunters will always tell the tale. So that, certainly there are those messages. But at the same time, there's a big part of the industry that is not in line with the Erdogan political project. And their view is modernity. So they're showing a distinctly modern view of the Muslim world, but one that encapsulates traditional values. And that's part of its great success, actually. I mean, I would say that Bollywood did the same for a big period, that the older films of Bollywood had that kind of blend of traditional ideas and traditional families with modern values. But Bollywood has changed drastically and frighteningly in the last few years. And again, you see it being used in almost propagandistic ways. But I think that exists in all films. You know, I said to someone the other day that, you know, China, of course, is the great big shadow looming in the background. And they said, well, you know, shouldn't we be nervous about watching Chinese, I mean, should we be nervous about receiving this? And I don't think so. We've been receiving political messages the entire time. You know, they've just been American messages or French messages or English messages. It's up to us to be a little discerning with what we're taking from our entertainment.
And even like apolitical things, right? Like you mentioned the example of the Peru men, it's okay to cry.
Yeah.
Right? That's a cultural norm.
Yes.
Right? That's being kind of promoted to a degree.
Exactly. I mean, Shah Rukh Khan said to me that everywhere he goes in the world that there's like 8 or 10 German grandmothers who follow him around. And they just, wherever he's filming, they're there in the background smiling at him, and they don't bother him. They just go there. And part of how he understood it, or he was told by other people in Germany, that they felt as a society they were so wound up, I mean tightly wound up. And it was Bollywood films that allowed them to cry. That allowed them, I mean I cry when I watch Bollywood films for different reasons. But that it allowed them to express their feelings and their sentiments. Yeah, that's a great point. Hi.
Hey, Assalamu alaikum, John Zaid. Question around culture, pop culture, as you said, transcends into politics and creates a different dimension. What's the role of a cultural icon or a pop culture star now, given the atmosphere we're in right now? What kind of role and responsibilities do they have to portray the culture or their values?
That's interesting. I mean, I feel like that's more an American question, isn't it, in a way? Like I'm just waiting for somebody to do a study on like capitalism and the Kardashian family or something. But yeah, that's a larger question, I guess, of celebrity and what cultural values the celebrity encapsulate. I mean, part of that is also what you said. It's a old-fashioned kind of patriarchy, isn't it, of masculinity and of strength and having everything. But I hope it's breaking down. I mean, one of the strange things in the Korean example is that Korean stars are very heavily controlled because of this, because they are supposed to encapsulate a mythology rather than an idea. So they go through this factory system where hundreds of thousands of dollars are spent on the training of a Korean pop star for up to 5 years before you've ever even heard of them. They're taught how to stand, how to sit, how to talk. They're taught different languages, how to dress. And then when they are unleashed on the world, they operate really, I mean, not as human beings. So one of the things they were banned from doing was using public toilets because people couldn't think that they were ordinary humans. I mean, they had to have this kind of weird aura around them. So I think the idea of celebrity itself is so bizarre and false that it can't possibly, it can't really be a great conduit for interesting values at least.
I think my question goes off on that theme a bit, so
Yeah.
forgive me for that. But I'm from India, so I'm going to keep my question to Shahrukh
Sure.
Khan. There's a conversation that I've repeatedly had with a bunch of folks from Africa and Sierra Leone, Eritrea. They're like, man, you guys don't understand how much Bollywood influenced our lives. Or like, what's
Basic
dressed."
to you?
Yeah.
Okay.
And they're like, do you like Shahrukh Khan? And I was like, not that much. And they get very upset. And the weirdly, also speaking of that, I had a professor, Vijay Prashad, I think you know him.
Oh yes, yes, of course.
He had a very funny story about how he was interviewing an Al Qaeda leader in a camp, and he was like, "Who's your favorite Bollywood actor?" So coming back to Shah Rukh Khan, I feel like my grievance with him is like he's an actor capable of being delivering fantastic performances.
Yeah.
But sometimes he just picks shitty films or stories.
Okay.
And unlike many other actors in Bollywood, he's actually someone who comes across as supremely well-read, who has opinions, and he thinks through things. It's not just like, oh, you know, I have a hot take on this.
Yeah.
But for whatever reason, he has decided to close down or pick his fights to a very minimal degree now in the last 10 years. But if you would look at some of his interviews from the 90s and stuff,
sure.
And that comes through, and that's partly because of his upbringing. His father was a freedom fighter and all those things. So I guess, from the last question I wanted to ask you was like, what did you get out of like conversations with Shah Rukh Khan?
Yeah.
When it comes to things like this, in terms of responsibility as a celebrity or whatever, or how or why he thinks about not saying certain stuff out loud.
Yeah, that's a really good question actually. I mean, I'll try and answer it in a couple of ways. What you pointed out is really interesting and is quite unique. Shah Rukh has a completely unique background from anyone in Bollywood. His father was a freedom fighter, and he's from Peshawar originally, and was involved in Quit India and a lot of movements of that time, and that I think that is what makes him loved in a lot of ways across the border, but not necessarily only that. I think the story you had of Vijay's story is a great one, and I've got a parallel to that. I went to the Kailash Valley several years ago, which is in the extreme sort of north of Pakistan, and for most of the year you can't get to the Kailash Valley. It's snowed in. You can only go between May and August or whatever it is. And for those of you who don't know the Kailash Valley, it's where it's said that the descendants of Alexander the Great, where his troops mutinied after the disastrous Greek campaign in India, many troops mutinied and stayed on, married locals, and lived there. And so their descendants are the Kalasha people, who still follow like a quite pagan, animistic religion. They mark time by celebrating the seasons and the harvest. And they're a matriarchal society, so the men are furniture and the women run everything. They have a very beautiful and unique sense of dress. Their hair is done in a unique way, and they're the breadwinners, so they live there continually. And there's not so many Kalasha left now, but maybe 3,000, something like that. And they're completely cut off. Okay, so to get there, you've got to fly to Chitral, then you've got to drive for 3 hours, and then you find yourself in a valley that has no electricity, no TV, no cell phone service, no newspapers, nothing. They cool their water by placing bottles in the stream. You know, I mean, it's really cut off. And when I went in 2007, I went to write for a Pakistani paper, and one of the women elders said, "Would you like to come and see one of our community centers? You know, the women are also the ones who, they do handicrafts and we sell them, and that's how we." Yes, how nice. And I go to this sort of cabin, and as I enter the cabin, there's all these women on looms and, you know, weaving, and behind them on the wall is a photograph of Shah Rukh. And so I asked them, I said, "Sorry, who's this? You know, you don't have lights, you don't have film, you don't have TV. Who's this guy?" And they're like, "We don't know." but they obviously, you know. I was like, "Where did you get it from?" They're like, "Oh, something." But they also had their favorite Shah Rukh Khan film. I mean, he transcends electricity. Which is really something. But yes, I mean, the most interesting Bollywood film that I've seen lately, at least, that had a sort of interesting political, cultural tinge was Gully Boy. I mean, did you see that? I thought that was a really good film. That was a great film. But I feel it's a rare film for Bollywood today. Most of them aren't encapsulating any important values or dissent or just something contra to the establishment. And there's that great scene in Gully Boy where they go around defacing, for those of you who haven't seen it, billboards and stuff, and they see a Fair and Lovely ad, and they cover it with Brown is Beautiful. I mean, I never thought I'd see that in a Bollywood film. I was impressed by that. I've forgotten the rest of the question, I'm sorry. Was there something I didn't address?
There's
specifically about Shah Rukh Khan as a person.
Oh, as a person.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that I have anyone else to compare him to in Bollywood, but he is a well-read person. I think he's a curious person. He's someone who writes. His father was a poet. But when I went to interview him, I was there to essentially observe him. I was a fly on the wall, as it was. But I think the thing, unfortunately, with Bollywood is that it's very hard, as you said, to see anyone having a political opinion in Bollywood today. And though he did certainly stand up and I think suffered quite a bit for that in the past, I haven't seen anything he said recently, or in fact anyone else.
I think after the whole My Name Is Khan fiasco that he had with Shiv Sena,
Oh yeah.
after that he's definitely
He stopped.
And he was honest about it. He's like, man, this film is not just about me, it's about 200 other people who are making it.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to risk the film getting cut off.
Apropos of nothing, I mean, I did write about it in the book, but I was fascinated by Karan Johar's hostage video. You know, where he, after Eid al-Mushkil, is that?
Yeah,
Eid
yeah.
al-Mushkil, where he had to make a video. This is one of the biggest directors in Bollywood who made what looks like a hostage video promising never to work with Pakistani talent again. And I did write to Karan to interview him, but I'm Pakistani, so I guess he was afraid of making another video.
Should try Anurag Kashyap next time.
Yes, he's interesting. You're right. Thank you.
I'm happy to say that we are about 10 minutes left, so we're going to limit questions to people who are already in line over there.
Ms. Bhutto, thank you for coming. It's very
Thank
nice to see a Pakistani talent being recognized.
you.
Forgive me, my question isn't about your book.
Okay.
My uncle is Shahid Khan Abbasi, who's former Prime Minister of Pakistan. Right now, he's currently spending time in jail. This is the second time we spent time in jail. Last time was between 99 and 2012. I just wanted to get your thoughts on the political situation in Pakistan, where opposition leaders are being locked up and the media is being censored. I just wanted to get your thoughts on the situation.
Thank you for coming and for your question. Yeah, I think it's, as always, it's a fraught time in Pakistan. I mean, I think today censorship is practiced a little more enthusiastically than it has been in recent years. And certainly there is victimization and there are leaders being arrested. One also has to distinguish, because in the case of Asif Zardari being arrested, I mean, there's 30 years worth of corruption cases and murder cases on the man's record. So it's impossible to see that as victimization. But certainly there is, and I think unfortunately disrupting a really powerful moment for Pakistan. And I think Pakistanis have always been incredibly brave about their opinions and about engaging in conversations that are against the government. And it's disappointing to see that being stopped, whether online or on the streets. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, my name is Saqib Shah. Forgive me for asking something that is not related to this discussion. We are just desperately, waiting for you to join politics. So when will that exactly happen? Do you know that?
I don't exactly know that. I've always said, I mean, I am very interested in politics and I consider myself a political person. But I don't think what I do is apolitical or unpolitical. I think it is quite political. The only difference is that I don't hold an office. And that allows me a certain freedom to say what I think and feel, really.
When will you run for an office?
Oh.
Yeah, so I mean that is exactly what I was trying to ask.
Oh, okay.
So,
I don't have any plans at the moment.
okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, my name is Amar Nagari, and I'm thankful to you for being here, and it's my, what you say, valuable experience. I have a question. I think you are very much fascinated with anthropology. You like cultures, and we all agree, the cultures are scholars alike. Which culture has the most fascinated you? And you said that K-pop has a coded message.
Yeah.
Are those messages negative too? And how they just like influence the society?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good question. K-pop's messages are conservative messages. So they are messages of family, of community, of working hard, studying hard, respecting your elders. There's a band trying to break it into America called NCT 127 lately, and I'm just looking up their song names, and they're like this sweetest song names you can think of. One is called Simon Says, and the other one is like How Are You Today? And you know, so they're not disruptive in the sense of how we're used to thinking that music can be sometimes. They're oppressively positive in terms of its messaging. And the second question, I mean, I've always been interested in culture just globally, worldwide. I'm fascinated by it. But one of the things I wrote about in the book, and that I wrote about even as a university student, is Pakistani culture and how its resistance and political dissent has been coded in. And the story I always like to tell for people who might not know this is in the 1980s, when Pakistan was under its most oppressive military dictatorship. We had a CIA-backed dictator named General Zia-ul-Haq who brutalized society. So Zia-ul-Haq made amputation the punishment for theft. And in all of Pakistan, he couldn't find anybody to carry out an amputation. After every single doctor just about in the country refused, they went to butchers and said, will you carry out? And the butchers refused. Just to give you a sense of Zia-ul-Haq's terror, yes, and brutality of the country. And it's at that time that you have incredible art in Pakistan. So Faiz Ahmed Faiz, it's at that time that he writes Hum Dekhenge, which is a poem about the falling of tyranny and the erasure of dictatorship. And Faiz paid for that. Faiz was forced to leave his country. He went to Beirut. He lived in Lebanon. And even after Faiz paid for that, Iqbal Banu stands up on a stage in Lahore and sings that poem in front of a crowd. And for that act of defiance and resistance, Iqbal Banu's career was effectively ended by the dictatorship. So that's one culture that I've always been fascinated by, and it not just its bravery, but its cultural value. I mean, those are beautiful artists as well.
Thank you, and another request, please come back.
Okay, thank you, I will.
Hi, so my name is Sylvie and I'm from India, Delhi.
Hi.
I was reading your book and I also was having discussion with my uncle, and we were trying to understand that, why look at Bollywood now? It's been there, it's been popular. You mentioned also, and we know that how Raj Kapoor was popular, and so many different actors throughout its history. So why look at Bollywood now?
Yeah.
And that is one. And second is, again, did you not want to look at Pakistani dramas?
Yeah. So those are both very good questions. So I did write briefly about Pakistani dramas, but the publishers